Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I'm very happy to bring the conversation I had with Sophia Rosenfeld. Sophia is a professor of history and chair of the Department of History at the University of Pennsylvania, where she focuses on European and American intellectual and cultural history. She has received her bachelor's from Princeton University and her Ph.D. from Harvard University. She has held numerous fellowships, and she has written many books, including the most recent, The Age of Choice, A History of Freedom in Modern Life. And that's what we talk about in this conversation. We start by talking about this concept of choice in different domains of society. We talk about choice and freedom in liberalism and neoliberalism context. And then we kind of go through what much of her book does, and we talk about the idea of choice in shopping, which is very, very interesting. We talk about choice in religion and how that had evolved. We talk about choosing romantic partners, choice in politics, choice in reproductive rights, and many other topics. I greatly enjoyed this conversation. Sophia is a wealth of knowledge and wisdom, and she was really, really fabulous in talking about many different areas and the history of different areas, but in such a relatable and tangible way. The book does this. You'll hear it in the conversation. Really, really made me have more thoughts after the conversation in all the best way. Of course, you can find this conversation and all other conversations at convergingdialogues.substack.com. I'm also on YouTube. So like, subscribe, share with your friends, contribute. All of that is much appreciated. And now I bring you Sophia Rosenfeld. I am here with Sophia Rosenfeld. Sophia, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. I'm looking forward to talking with you.
Thanks very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, of course, absolutely. You wrote a marvelous book called The Age of Choice, A History of Freedom in Modern Life, out through the always wonderful Princeton University Press. And that's what we're going to discuss today. Before we do, why don't you give folks a kind of snapshot of who you are professionally, academically, all the particulars, and anything else that's relevant for you now.
Sure. I'm a historian, and I teach at the University of Pennsylvania. And my field is a little bit of an odd one. I'm an intellectual historian, a cultural historian, but my specialty is really the history of democracy from its early modern foundations up to the present. And that's in part what this book is about.
Yeah, I was telling you before we started, this is one of the most novel books I've read. I read quite a lot, so it's always nice to see something that kind of surprises you in a good way. The book is about choice, and it's basically 5 big chapters. And when I went into it with no expectations, and I start reading it. And I was, okay, we're talking about shopping. All right, consumerism, shopping. I was not expecting that to start us off. And then it just goes into, what we believe, how we choose our ideas in terms of religion, about romantic choice, political choice. And I was like, okay, I get it. Choice in all these ways, but very unassuming things. We don't get into really the free will argument head on. We don't do the religious predestination stuff, although you wave to it. So I guess tell us how you came to write this book on this topic in this way, I guess, is what's really interesting to me.
Yeah, you mentioned that I don't really delve into the question of do we have free will, which is a philosopher's debate and a debate of anybody interested in theology and really, for that matter, biology today. But I'm less interested in can we, in some real sense, make choices than why we believe that we can and organize our societies around the idea today that choice is really what makes us human. So it's really not so important if we are biologically programmed in some way, as much as the fact that so much of our lives as modern people, especially in the West, but really now globally, think of choice as what freedom is all over the world and in every kind of domain, from picking your breakfast cereal to picking your spouse to picking your president. So I got interested in this idea of writing a book about choice for really two reasons. One is perhaps more historical, which is, as a historian of democracy, I'm always interested in the things that we assume, but don't talk very, very much, which undergird democracy. Things like, for instance, a conviction about the importance of truth. My last book was about truth and democracy. In this case, choice is one of those things that seems so ordinary to us. Everybody's picked something off a menu of some kind in recent life, that I thought we don't really think about what it does for us to have this kind of faith in choice across so many domains. So part of this was to try to explain why we live the way we do. The other part, I think, was really, in a way, more personal. Choice is supposed to be what gives us freedom, but many of us, and myself included, often find choice very difficult. It's hard to, you go online and there are hundreds of something you're looking to purchase. You need some new socks. Don't put socks into your browser. You'll get thousands of options. And in fact, it doesn't feel very freeing to have thousands of options on something very everyday. You might want to just have two pairs and pick the cheaper one or the better looking one or something. And so I was curious also how we'd gotten ourselves into a situation in which choice is both celebrated, but sometimes undermines either our own psychological well-being or our collective good. And those two things drove me to kind of ask, how did this happen and with what consequences?
Yeah, the bit about the socks is funny. It's almost it's like the Kierkegaard thing, right? When you look out into the world and you see how much freedom you have, you're overwhelmed. Or overcome with this existential angst or dread or anguish. Is like, this is anxiety of sorts of like, well, I don't know what to do. There's too many options almost, right? Yes, I have freedom, but that is contributing to this, kind of existential anxiety that many people have. And in a more tangible way, I don't know if this is so much maybe a global thing, maybe it is, but yes, if you go to a supermarket and kind of on consumerism for a bit, you have too many choices. You go into an aisle and you have 2,000 choices of toothpaste, and
right.
The idea is that there's only 3 companies really that that own the toothpaste anyways, right? But they're going to give you this illusion of choice of all these different things, and it is interesting that the psychology of how people make decisions on these types of things. I can remember I had this conversation on the podcast with Pinar Yildirim. She's at the University of Pennsylvania. She's in marketing. She teaches there, and she does also in economics, and she does a bunch of different things. And we talked about this. I think we talked about different things about how people have choice about what they want to do, but it really does depend on what people are choosing or more so how their psychology and their development is of like. Some people might choose something that's cheaper. Some people might choose something because the label looks nice. Some people might choose something because they saw a commercial for it. And it's just all these different kind of nodes in which people, have which avenue do they take. And so as you talk about in the book, there's these ideas of, I never really thought of it, that way. But, in during the Enlightenment, I guess, people started to have different choices about which type of, if you will, Protestant denomination you could choose. And it just started to just splinter into so many. And then obviously we have political choices. So it's really interesting how this seemingly more is amazing, but not so much. I think kind of what you're saying is that sometimes it's too overwhelming. It's too overwhelming in how many quote unquote choices we have. People just kind of get flooded and overwhelmed, and it's like, okay, I don't know what to do. I don't know what to pick. And so I guess the question on that would be is that really freeing? I guess. Maybe not.
So it's really interesting because a lot of you mentioned somebody in marketing, for instance, and people in behavioral economics, in marketing, in areas of psychology today have tended to tell us something that has been a little shocking maybe for some kinds of mainstream economists, which is that people aren't very good at picking, actually. That we're not really, that we economists assume we're going to know our mind, we're going to have full information, and we're going to go in and pick something that matches our preferences. So whether it's toothpaste or anything else, including in a supermarket. Mm-hmm. That said, what most of these people now say is actually we're easily persuaded by advertising. We change our mind from day to day. We get into ruts of various kinds. We make quick decisions without thinking about the long-term consequences. In fact, we're pretty bad at the major thing we do, and it causes us a certain amount of stress doing it. Most people would always prefer a smaller number of options that were good ones to lots of bad ones. That's a sort of basic idea. And it sounds like a real discovery, but if you read any novels ever, you will know that novelists have long known, since the 18th century, that most of us find choosing difficult, and we're always confronted with conflicting pressures of different kinds. And the novel I think of is really a product of the era when choice comes into being, comes into its own as a kind of central part of how we live. And novels often dramatize somebody, often a woman, but sometimes a man too, who's caught, wants this, but feels pressure from this, isn't sure if they want to do that or this. And the series of decisions they make, those, whether that's navigating a marriage market or finding a path through life in professional terms, is the subject of so many novels, 18th, 19th, 20th century till today. And novelists knew that we're really conflicted and it's psychologically difficult. Few of us operate in the way that, say, an economist would generally assume, at least for the purposes of theorizing, as somebody who just knows their mind and acts on those preferences, which are entirely internal.
Yeah, it's again once you kind of see it, then you kind of see it everywhere. Which is, as I was reading, I was, oh yeah, that's true. You do see it here. I never saw in this kind of context. You mentioned that this idea of freedom starts in liberalism, which many folks have written about, and then it kind of progresses to a more neoliberal idea of how we see choice in the modern world. How does this sort of start and kind of progress into where we're at, where we see freedom kind of with the, I guess, traditional roots of liberalism and now more neoliberal kind of concepts? What are you saying there?
Well, I guess the big arc, you could say, of the story is that for the first development, there may be two steps to this. The first development is the emergence of various kinds of variety and pluralism that create a set of conditions in which it's possible for people to start choosing things. And the emergence of people that I call, borrowing from the behavioral economists, choice architects, are the people like marketers who set up the options, or people who run political parties, who kind of organize for us a menu of possibilities that we can choose from. And over time, that becomes more and more important to many different domains, really from the late 17th century onwards. And by the mid-19th century, you mentioned liberalism. If you think of somebody like John Stuart Mill, starts to suggest, not out of the blue, but based on the way people are, in England at least, largely already living, that choice is a kind of freedom, and that this needs to be extended to more people, including women, and that having the possibility of shaping one's own life, making decisions that allow you to get what you want, essentially, is not only a way to feel better, to be happier, but it's what gives us autonomy. It's what gives us standing in the world. And that becomes a kind of standard liberal idea. I don't think the two strands really come together, the commercial part and the political part, or capitalism and democracy, until sometime in the 20th century. But what starts to happen, what you call neoliberalism right now, is in the last 50 years or so, part of the value of choice has become not just what do you get out of it, it's not just instrumental, it's that choice itself becomes a new value. And neoliberalism is the sort of moralizing of choice itself. And that's had some wonderful effects. I'm not arguing at all that choice is always bad or something like that. It leads to all kinds of emancipatory programs, including feminism. But it can also lead us astray in various ways. And what we've seen lately is that this emphasis on choice actually can be combined with various authoritarian forms of government too. You can still have formal elections, you can still have supermarkets, and it can go perfectly well with largely undemocratic modes of governing as well. I think that's been a really discovery of the 21st century.
Yeah, I think that's right too. It's almost like learning how to work within a system that's there, but to still have some kind of, whether it's explicitly stated or not, nefarious intentions. So yeah, that's interesting how that's this kind of choice kind of becomes a value of sorts, right? That we're seeing that this is a value we have to choose, which. Yeah, I don't know. I agree with you. I think there's obviously pros and cons. You could see that in positive or negative ways, but it's interesting to see it in and of itself become a value. Which again, I mean, there's probably wonderful pieces to it, but then I think that sometimes we forget that there's darker sides of some of the values that we have of sorts, or it could be used for kind of negative intentions.
Exactly.
So, as I mentioned earlier, you start the book off with shopping, which was kind of fun. It was a kind of fun thing to read about. It's coming from a historical lens, but it was very interesting with catalogs and how do things come about and all these things. So yeah, why did you start the book there? I guess is that again, how do we come up with all these sales techniques and how we have these ways of trying to give you the element of choice? Like what was the point of starting with sort of the history of that?
So I thought one of the things that I wanted to do was uncover, in some sense, the roots of our current obsessions. And that took me back not just to sort of philosophy, who said what, when, and because people don't really change the way they live that often around philosophical texts alone. There have to be kind of lived experiences or social practices that people do, as well as think about, that make them organize their lives and thus think about their lives a little differently than they had before. And to me, it seemed evident, though it wasn't usually talked about that much, that as things like stores started to be a part of our landscape, auctions, stores, shopping streets, even the word itself, shopping, which doesn't exist until the late 18th century. People certainly provisioned their houses before then and bought food, and bought cloth. But the whole idea of an experiential quality to purchasing things, that you'd go out to a special place, walk around, that somebody would display the options, that you could hem and haw over them and decide, I think I prefer the blue to the green, but I'm not sure. Let me give it a little more thought here. The kind of thing that's very ordinary for us. Every time you order a sandwich somewhere, you're, in a sense, browsing the options, looking at a menu. This is not an eternal and universal way of getting things for yourself that you or your family need. It has very specific origins. And I was interested in how by the late 17th century, but increasingly in the 18th century, in the cities of Western Europe, this new almost form of entertainment emerges around the fact that these states, increasingly enmeshed in the world, often in colonial relationships, are bringing to these centers a range of possibilities that opens up new commercial possibilities for consumers. So I looked at auction houses and the sale of cloth and the sale of ordinary things. Prices had to get low enough for ordinary people to be able to have some discretionary spending, but even more to the point, there had to be enough options that maybe not 50 kinds of toothpaste in the supermarket aisle, but let's say 3 different colors of cloth at the same price point with no moral valence associated with one or the other, where the consumer could simply make a decision based on what were sometimes called in the 18th century whim or fancy, we might call preference or predilection.
It's interesting because I'll come back to some of the specifics, but nowadays it seems like there's it's strange. It's less about the experience now. Now it's more about accessibility, I guess. So like most people like we don't really have as many shopping malls anymore. I mean, they still exist, but they're infrequent. They're less in total. Even like strip malls, even what are those things called? Outlets that some people go to as well. Those are less now. Now everybody buys in front of a screen. And then they, a couple of clicks and that's it. And then, it's at your door in a couple of days or whatever it is. And you're still doing the same thing. You still have a million options. You have more options now because you have the whole world in front of you. You have all these. You can get something from China if you want directly, or Korea, or bring it here to the States, or vice versa. And that might have been more difficult or more expensive or things like that. And so it's interesting how, when you're looking at the history of this, it's like, yes, you have people kind of start to scale up on that. And then we had a moment where we were, we've all been to a shopping mall or stores or things like that. And now it seems like it's gone the other way, where it's less about that. I mean, what do you, you don't quite talk about that in the book in terms of very current day, but I guess sort of looking historically at kind of that arc. What do you make of this, I guess?
You're absolutely right. I'm fascinated by this. I mean, the department store, when it emerges in the late 19th century in cities from Chicago to Mexico City to Paris, is one of the great marvels of its time. And they were almost temples to consumerism. There's a marvelous one, which is now a Macy's, and where I live in Philadelphia, that's about to go out of business. Last department store in the city, really sadly, is going to leave. But it's in a store that was Wanamaker's in the 19th century, it has the world's largest organ in it. It's full of sculpture. It's in a marvelous building. And it reminds you of when this was experiential consumerism was essential to city life. In my own city of Philadelphia right now, what you're talking about is very real. Many storefronts are shuttered. They haven't recovered from COVID. But it's also just on the creation of online shopping has also meant a decline in the physical stores, except for things you absolutely can't do online. You can't get a haircut online, so you still have to go somewhere. But you can easily buy a pair of sneakers. So there are different kinds of realms. Amazon was set up to be as much like a store and an opportunity for choice as possible. You still put things in baskets. I mean, it's
or carts or whatever.
Select with carts or baskets. You select items with your click. I mean, it's a virtual, it's kind of simulacrum of real shopping. But as you say, now what people really want is the choice itself. So what's left is, in a sense, pure choice, because there's not much else to it. You click in the same way, but you get what you want, and you know where to go to all these either giant emporiums or sort of specialized sites that get you into some area of consumerism that's particularly for you. You're buying golf clubs, or you're buying, a certain kind of music, and you know where to go to find those very particular things. And of course, algorithms also help and hurt you in creating a vast number of things for you to select among, but also steering you constantly towards the things your friends like, or the things that you already like, and more of the same, whether that's news consumption or fashion.
Yeah, you're sort of cutting out the middle management here, and everything's kind of curated, or it can be kind of curated to what your interests are. Again, algorithms, hurt and help that, but that's definitely where it is, which is interesting because, and I'm kind of thinking about this in a moment. You mentioned that the notion of choice for consumers, 18th or 19th, 20th century, sort of contributed to this status and social ranking in society, right? As you're saying, these kind of temples of consumerism, what you're wearing, how people can see it. When you're going out to get the next thing, people can see what you have. And you talk about this for women, which is also an interesting story here of how then it started really kind of going towards the audience, or was towards women. So you can talk about that. But if everything is exported, I guess, to being online now, it's interesting because I would imagine that if you're trying to signal out in the world certain elements of status or social ranking, but you have no place to do it like these places were, you have to find another way of doing that, which is also interesting because, that's what we see social media platforms or people that are, on YouTube, or they have, they're on TikTok or on a Discord server. They're finding other alternative ways of still getting the same thing, which again is a fascinating thing. But anyways, yeah, tell us about the idea though of getting status, social ranking in society, and then tell us that story about how consumerism started directing the kind of ways in which they were doing things towards women and women having some options for choice and how selling products to them specifically.
Yeah, status is a really interesting part of this, I think. In many societies, status was marked by what you were allowed to wear for a very long time. There were kind of rules around fashion all over the world. Only aristocrats or nobles could wear a certain sword or a certain kind of cloth, not just because they were the only people who could afford it, but it simply was legislated that clothing went with rank. And so the question of sort of choice was not central to a world in which status was secure and marked and very hierarchical. The two things emerge together, a kind of fluidity in social status and this notion of choice. But of course, over time, what sounds very egalitarian, everybody can choose what they like. The right to choose is now often part of human rights decrees, but we all know we don't choose with the same resources, we don't choose with the same access, we don't choose with the same knowledge. And of course, we are blamed or praised for our good or bad choices later without much thinking about what were your options. I mean, we know that equality of opportunity to choose, say, doesn't exist in our world. It might exist around toothpastes, but get to anything more serious, educational, for instance, you're never going to find something like that. So choice also, over time, itself became the source of kind of status. Are you choosing the right paths in life, but also are you wearing the right things? Are you wearing the right brands? Are you fashionable in today's terms? Those become new markers of status. They're more fluid than the old ones, for sure, but they hardly have created a kind of egalitarian ethos. For women particularly, since you mentioned that, I decided to look a fair amount at women because in some ways, they're the original choosers. They're the first shoppers. The first stores cater to women and they're accused of engaging in something that wasn't very morally serious, but they're given this small window of possibility, especially if they were pretty middle class and lived in an urban place and, could spend the afternoon with other women in group looking over ribbons or fabrics. It was maybe a small area of autonomy, but it was something. And women were then restricted from most other kinds of serious choice, including, of course, political choice, sexual choice, lots of other realms. But if you study the history of feminism, you'll notice that little opportunity of choice creates a kind of possibility that it can be acted on. Even as women are stigmatized as being kind of consumer choice makers, they ask increasingly and demand choice in politics, in whether to be a mother, in education, in a lot of different realms. Feminism grows up alongside this kind of liberalism we were talking about a minute ago. And even John Stuart Mill, the sort of most famous feminist of the 19th century, frames the possibility as why can't women have the choices that men do? Because we know how important choice is. And that's behind women's suffrage and all the way up to abortion, which is framed very explicitly, of course, about the right to choose, not about the right to health care or the right to justice or something else. It's the framing of the 1970s, which is kind of the high point of this sort of thinking, is nobody has to like what you decide, but autonomy means you have a right to make up your own mind about which of these options is best for you.
Yeah, I mean, that's still how it's continued to be framed. And I think it's one of those things where, it, again, goes back to the idea of a type of freedom, which I think is, again, if you're more philosophical about it, freedom is interesting because when you don't have it, you obviously want it, or many folks should have it. But freedom can give you a lot, or choices can give you a lot of, again, anxiety about what do I do? Okay, I got this thing or the potential for it, but what do I do with it? And now it's just too many things, and it's an interesting conundrum, I guess, that folks can have. You bring us to the Reformation, which this was a fun part of the conversation. The book is really, really cool because it kind of, there's this sort of kind of connection, I guess, sort of within the chapters. Each one kind of is by themselves, but this kind of, you kind of go through time of sorts, which is cool. And so you talk about religion. Religion becomes a choice. We see all these new belief systems that arise as a component of choice, specifically within Protestantism. You mentioned, especially I thought it was quite unique of sorts within the Pennsylvania area. You have, I'll list some of them, have Quakers, Mennonites, the Amish, Lutherans, Anglicans, Baptists, African communities, Catholics, Jews. You have all of these different kinds of groups, kind of popping up. Some of these most of these I think are still around. But they're connected with, again, as religion is all over the world, family ties, neighborhoods, ethnic, racial, linguistic identification, the sense of identity. It's almost like a choosing of identity of sorts in some ways. How do you see this rise of how we can choose now? Now we don't just have Catholic, Protestant, let's say, within Christianity. Now you can have all of these other different kind of iterations, like some of which I just named, where we see that happening in the 19th and then 20th centuries.
Yeah, and I'm definitely not suggesting that even today one picks a church the way you pick a pair of socks.
Right.
There are many different pressures and many more profound questions that go into thinking about what is one going to believe and what is one going to practice, especially if it's not an occasional thing but a part of wrapped up in one's whole identity. That said, what happens after the Reformation is extremely interesting, and I sort of start the book with these two parallel moments. One, this question about shopping that we've just been talking about, and the second is the religious sphere, and that might seem like a very strange combination. But the end of the Reformation, the sort of end result was two things. One, a splintering of Christianity into different sects and kinds. So that instead of Christianity being one thing, it was very different to be a German Lutheran than to be a Catholic Italian. Mm-hmm. These were different versions. And of course, the wars of religion meant that there was no sense immediately they could coexist. It meant that one had to dominate the other. But eventually, by the 18th century, pluralism is simply the story of Europe. And as colonies develop in parts of the world, it's the story of various parts of the world, most obviously North America, where people of a variety of different religions emigrate to get away from persecution, but find themselves living in complex ways, cheek-jowled with people of other faiths, especially in colonies like Pennsylvania, where William Penn decreed that there would be religious freedom. On top of that, the Protestant emphasis on the idea of freedom of conscience meant that religion was no longer something one simply had to accept as true, but was imagined as something one, certainly there was a right and a wrong way of doing things, but something one had to come to through one's conscience. One had to make a conscious choice to accept the truth of some position. Mm-hmm. And that combination of things over time, again, these are slow processes, there's no one moment that's decisive, led to the idea that one could, in a sense, select a religion for oneself. Maybe that didn't mean you shopped all the world's great faiths, but it might mean picking a church. It might mean, and what I thought was so interesting was that tourists come to 18th century Philadelphia, and the same way you might now visit a lot of tourist sites or go see different shows on Broadway if you come to New York or something like that, people attended a variety of churches. It was an experience again. It was cool to hear what do Quakers do? What do the Baptists do? Who are those Mennonites? And people leave us records of trying out lots of different services. Maybe they aren't going to wholesale adopt a new faith tomorrow, but these are intellectual experiences. They're forms of entertainment, and they're forms of sort of intellectual stimulation, the same way you might today hear 3 different podcasts. I don't know. And sort of, you don't have to agree with all of them, but you might be tempted to hear a variety of possibilities. So in this sense, a certain element of choice in minister, choice in church, choice in reading material, lending libraries start to emerge around the same moment. I see a certain kind of parallel, even though it's not identical, to what happens in the commercial sphere.
Yeah, it is. It is interesting because you're how there's a freedom of conscience. There is, once you open up, when whether he realized it or not, when Luther nailed those 95 theses on that door, you kind of open up the Pandora's box, and you don't put the lid over it, and that's kind of what happened. Is, well, okay, well, now for 600 years or whatever, maybe longer, you have the one church, the Catholic Church Universal, and now we're going to say, yeah, maybe not. Okay, well, we can just do that again and again and again and again and again. And it becomes, I do think that there's, again, many historians have written about this. Once you get the printing press, and then once you get, Bibles in people's hands, and then people are able, and then other types of religious text along with other, then you start to get sort of commentaries and things like that. Then you start to say, well, wait a minute. I'm kind of reading this and I'm seeing it my way here, and we're going to do it this way. And you really start to see, kind of these branches, right? You might get the whole kind of Calvin Wesleyan divide, right? And then you get, from that all the Methodist, and then you get the Nazarenes, and you get the, all these iterations of Wesley, and Calvinist has Baptist, and you have all these different kind of, splintering of sorts. And you mentioned in the book, help but think that, access to books and to reading and to religious texts and all these things, really help spur, because then people have accessibility, as people become more literate, and then they're able to read for themselves, and then they're given this kind of, freedom of sorts. Then they can make up their own minds and say, well, you know what, and so I like what this group's doing over here. The Quakers got a good thing going. They seem to really be reading it the way I like, or the way I agree with. And, maybe not so much. Let's go over here to the Anabaptists. They seem to have it figured out, and then you can just kind of pick kind of who you agree with of sorts, or who makes sense, or how you're reading it the same, or things like that. And it is, again, that's what I was saying in the beginning. There is a kind of sort of linkage there between, I sort of got it right away of like, I do see this sort of element of like, maybe this is maybe too crude, but you kind of go into the market and you look down the aisle and you're like, yeah, I'm going to go down this aisle, and okay, like it's not quite that way, because again, there are histories and people have certain identities of sorts, but you had the option that if you left or you didn't agree at a certain point, you could go to another maybe group or community that was doing it, maybe that was more aligned with you now as you saw things or understood things, which I thought was particularly interesting in kind of looking at that linkage.
I'm glad you found that interesting. I thought it was fascinating as I sort of got deeper into it too. Of course, the pressures around religious choice are a little different than around some other choices, as you say.
Sure.
There's family, there's moral expectations. There's even the question, are you going to be saved? If you do this, what are the consequences down the line? But all choices turn out to be bounded, is the term I use, meaning the freedom of choice is something of a misnomer. We don't make the options before us, and we are constantly being shaped in our decisions by what's proximate, what costs what are our family expectations, what would be good for us versus somebody else. We make all our choices in a context in which other things shape them, and that's not bad. That's just a fact. That's how we think about things. But sometimes we don't notice the externals. For instance, you point out that printing is really important, and it certainly is. You can't have libraries in a world of manuscripts. This kind of idea, you come in and you select what you want. But even the cheapness of paper declining over time is important to this story. You can't have ballots or catalogs or menus in restaurants. So some of the things we now are maybe online, but we're still used to paper forms of them too. Until paper's cheap enough and enough people are literate that you can circle things on a given sheet. So there's a kind of technical, practical part, and there's a sort of intellectual, deeper cultural currents. And I'm really interested in the way those kinds of things come together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, listen, folks may know that, again, like I mentioned, I love to read a lot, always have. And Princeton is always so nice to send me things, and so they always ask me, "So do you want a PDF or do you want?" I say, "No, please, if you can, just send me the hard copy." So I read hard copy books. I still do. It's the way I kind of interact with the text. It forces me to go a bit slower to understand it. If it's on a screen, I tried a screen. I had a Kindle. I had an iPad. I just don't like it. It's not the same. And yeah, when I go to a restaurant, I don't mind the QR code sometimes, but again, it's nothing. I want to hold the menu and I want to see it. I don't I don't want to look on my screen on my phone like I do for other things. So there is something, maybe it's just something that we're used to, and I'm not resistant to new technology of sorts. I think those things are fine, but I think it's my thing is, people. You get it in you whichever way you do, right? In terms of reading or things like that, so that's fine. But for me personally, maybe I'm showing my age here. I still like I need the tangible. I need to hold it, and so. But yeah, I can imagine, right? Hundreds of years ago when you finally get that and you're able to do it. I mean, there was all these. I've read so many biographies on Abraham Lincoln, that he used to walk like 6 miles to get 3 books or something that people would pass around in 4 towns that were separated by whatever. That's insane to think about that, right? To think about you're walking 6 miles in the dead of winter to go get, I forget there was 3 books he read over. It was the Bible, I think it was Shakespeare, and there was another book. And it's just that's wild to me. That's wild to think about how much people appreciate it. Many people still weren't literate. Many people didn't have books. You didn't just go to a store and buy it. Those types of things. And that was only in the early 19th century. So it's just interesting to see how that becomes super important, as you're saying, with how much it costs to print on paper, and it becomes cheaper, and all these things. Those things we take for granted, but super important. It's very, very, very fascinating.
It is really interesting, just the development of the possibility of variety in lots of different domains. Part of it has to do with urban living, too, that, if you live in a town and you know everybody and there is one church and one market on a Sunday or something, then the idea of kind of an endless variety of things, which to us seems impossible not to imagine, right? That you could always find something new to listen to read, to wear, to people to meet. This seems to be one of the conditions of modern life. But we have to think most people traditionally haven't lived in worlds where there's endless possibility in every domain. And it's been enormously intellectually productive in various ways, but it's also made us in some ways lonelier, less capable of acting with others or making collective decisions. So there's everything, there are trade-offs. But I just worry sometimes that we think of this as an absolute good.
Yeah.
The more, the better. More opportunities for choice, more choices. And in some ways that does sound liberating, but is there a point of no return? And is there a point where we, in a sense, have lost the connection to other people that's created by the idea that I sit at my computer screen by myself? Even reading, you mentioned passing around books. That's a very social activity. And we try to do that online. We sometimes send each other articles or we text things to each other, but largely we sit by ourselves in a kind of, even in an office place, behind a screen in which you're really in your own bubble to a certain extent, and you're interacting with texts and things like that, but in a very secondhand way. And our attention is constantly being pulled in different directions. And I do think it's made it hard for us to think about collective dilemmas. We solve problems for ourselves. Should I take a train at 2:00 or at 4:00? I'm looking at the Amtrak schedule or something like that. That's one kind of decision, and you could spend a lot of energy on that kind of thing. But how do we decide on things that require all of us to do something in concert? That's increasingly difficult.
Yeah, I'll come back to that because it's something I thought about as I was reading the book, and when I got to the end of it, not necessarily after reading the epilogue, but just generally reading the whole book, I had some ideas about the kind of the whole thing of it and all the different kind of domains you walk us through. You talk about I didn't know this. This is so like it was so funny in some ways to be like, wow, this is like a thing? Like this really it's so wild. These dance cards, tell us about this. Is so wild to me. Is the idea of choosing a partner. I mean, really, the big topic you're talking about in this chapter is about a woman's choice, how they can choose a partner, whether in certain situations, but then more broadly, these ideas of women choosing when it came to selecting partner and marriage and family in the 19th and even into the 20th century. But you give this illustrative example of these dance cards, which was quite funny to me. Yeah, tell us about that. But there's a kind of example for the larger idea of women choosing romantic partners and what that's, I guess, more broadly even what that's evolved from in terms of, if you want to call it courtship or mating or how we do things, dating. How does that kind of evolve?
I love this part too, because I think everybody's sort of curious. Well, okay, there's Tinder now, right? What did people do before Tinder? Well, they met people they knew, but what if you live somewhere where you didn't know everybody? How did people meet? How did you figure out who to court? We'll use the old-fashioned terminology, and eventually who to marry. And that dilemma asserts itself as soon as the possibility of parents not making the decision for their children emerges. Now, in the Western tradition, at least, women have always had the power of so-called consent, meaning they don't get to pick who the possibility is, but theoretically, they have some ability to say yes or no when presented with a choice. That's in Christianity and in legal tradition of the West as well. How much choice that was probably was not a lot, right. But it was no more a young person's decision to make. People got married at quite young ages, even in pretty much everywhere, but especially in the upper classes and the peasantry. Mm-hmm. And when it becomes possible for people to start imagining making unions themselves, the question is, how are you going to find somebody suitable? What's going to be the choice mechanism? And there's discussion of everything. Should there be newspaper advertisements? Which really sounds funny, except for the fact that's not that different from Tinder or something, right?
No, it's not.
You kind of put yourself out there, and the newspaper saying, age 28, live here, good at doing the wash, whatever it is.
It's their profile. It's their profile page.
It's their profile.
Right?
It's essentially the same thing. That doesn't turn out to be the most effective mechanism. But one of the things that happens in the 19th century especially is not only are balls given for the upper classes in private homes, but commercial dance spaces emerge. And a whole etiquette emerges in order to make it possible for two people to safely, essentially contract, even if for a few minutes, to take a trip around the dance floor. Because this is a very scary business. We all know today people get hurt all the time, so-called get hurt in relationships. But imagine a world in which there's no actual physical contact between unmarried people that's acceptable, essentially, except in this setting. There's no dating in the modern sense, but all over the world, European social dance takes hold. Not the entire world, but, I found dance manuals from everywhere from sort of Santiago to Stockholm in the 19th century that give all kinds of very similar rules of etiquette. You can only talk to the woman for this number of minutes. You must ask her to dance from the right side rather than the left side. You can't make small talk on the way onto the dance floor. All kinds of rules. And as a kind of social dancing that's very collective, gives way to things like the waltz, which is two people alone in something of a physical embrace, touching each other as they move around the dance floor, the rules get stricter and stricter in a way in order to kind of make choice work. I call that all the way through the kind of choice architecture. It's the same thing that governs what you can do in a store. It isn't law in the sense of kind of the state legislature makes laws about how to act in a ballroom, but they're just the etiquette that everybody needs to know, the conventions. The same way today, you know the rules of the game when you walk into any kind of establishment. What are you expected to be doing and how?
It's a script of sorts. It's a sort of script.
There is. And so the last piece is this dance cards. The little dance cards that you're referring to are, again, they start out as something more substantive than paper, but eventually by the 19th century, they're paper. They list the names of the dances on one side and they have a blank space on the other. And gentlemen could ask a woman for the pleasure of a dance. May I do the gavotte with you? Can we do the seventh waltz later in the evening? And either he or she would pencil in the name of the person. And it's a way of kind of, again, something like a menu. It's a way of kind of organizing who's chosen what at what time. And these were intended to be a little bit a souvenir of the evening, but even more, they were a way of organizing this chaotic realm of personal choice in a world in which a bad liaison, could lead to the downfall and ruin of a woman, and a good one. If you've ever read any Jane Austen, you'll be aware a good ball scene can lead to all kinds of promising things. The rules were also a little bit there to be played with, as any reader of Jane Austen would know.
Yeah, well, that's where you get all the drama. That's where you get all the good. That's all the good parts. That's
exactly
all. Right. Even you even see it a little bit in Tolstoy, a little bit. I think in War and Peace, you see it, right? Yeah, you just see it in so many novels, and it's, I don't know. There's something. It's like I don't know. I always like reading those novels, not because I want to, harken back to that time of sorts. Because granted, there's some obviously problems with it, but it does feel like it's sort of you've captured a moment in time of sorts that we just don't get anymore. Which is kind of, it's like you kind of in a novel you go back, and those types of novels specifically, you just kind of go in a time machine. You're like, wow, this life with humans was so interesting at this period. It's very, very fascinating reading those.
That's
things.
Absolutely the case about novels. They both present us with dilemmas that we really recognize, or we wouldn't relate to them so much. So in certain ways, these are emotional moments.
Human things.
Oh my gosh, right. Yeah. Who doesn't feel the pain of the terrible downfall of Anna Karenina or something like that, or Madame Bovary? But at the same time, we're cast into a world where the rules are quite different and the pressures are different. And it's both that sort of, as you say, that sort of time capsule quality, but also the fact that the dilemmas are in some ways so recognizable.
That's right, yeah.
That makes novel reading of the great novels still, why is a novel written 200 years ago a page turner sometimes? Precisely for that fact.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I reread Anna Karenina 2-3 years ago, and I was like, it was riveting. I know the story, but I was just like, I hadn't read it in a while. Crime and Punishment has that effect. I'm reading Master and Margarita. Yeah, that's more recent, but yeah, it's just novels. They have this kind of element where it's the human condition, and so the setting and structure is a little bit different, but you can relate to it. Even when you read, older kinds of, even some of the myths and things like that, which is those things I think are just super super important.
That's the thing. Those great Russian novels you're referring to are as much about the psychology of the people in them as they are about their actions and their consequences.
100%.
And what you get is that relationship, and that's really why novels are so interesting, I think, for thinking about choice, is you get the scenarios in which they're making these decisions, but you get access to their thought processes because of the style of the realist novel, where you're watching these people kind of make what seem like real-time decisions. Should I do this or do that? Oh no.
Right. And you're with the Russians in particular, they just have these very long dialogue scenes where it's just conversations, but somehow they make it very interesting. I know for, maybe was it Demons, or maybe it was Crime and Punishment. I don't remember. Maybe it was all the major 5 Dostoevsky wrote, but he would take a series of newspaper clippings, newspaper articles from the moment, mid 1860s, Russia, and he would sort of start to blend together and make his stories that way and find his characters and things like that. And so you're really having this fictionalized element of real humans in a particular time, in a particular place. And again, that's the interesting thing about humans is no matter how times are or not, there's still the human quality of it, and that's where you're getting the kind of psychology of things and how people do things. Is we change and we evolve, and at the same time we don't. And so there's these interesting kind of scenarios, this element of choice, which is deeply fascinating. So you also talk about politics, of course, and it's interesting. I mean, we just had an election here in the States where we chose, which president or representative or senator or school board or elected official, and we do that here in the U.S. It looks different in other parts of the world, of course. But this idea, though, where do you sit, I guess, with this idea of political freedom? How do we have that? You talk about the ballot, how it came about, all these things, which was really interesting. But political freedom looks different in many parts of the world. You can point to Syria, and it's very different for them than it is for for us in the U.S. Or you can look to Hungary or other places. There's politics looks different, obviously, but even within the differences of politics, pick your brand of authoritarianism nowadays, right? So we got different shades of it in different parts of the world, right? It's all a little different, but it's sort of kind of the same playbook. But there's still this illusion of sorts of choice or freedom. How do you can use the ballot as an example, but what do you make of this idea of how we've come to have political freedom or choice?
I'm fascinated by this question, because elections have become a kind of gold standard around the world for what political freedom is. The idea being that the people, in some form, have some say over their government. And elections were not universal until really the parts of the 20th century.
Yeah.
But we also know now that elections can often be held in very authoritarian cultures. The results can be rigged. You can run one candidate and no others. You can give people the illusion, in some ways, of making a decision, and it doesn't have to work. That it creates something like liberal democracy, for sure, especially if there are no protections for civil rights to go alongside the majoritarian rule. The other thing that's odd about elections is it's the rare place in which we choose, but we don't really get what we chose. We get the aggregation of all the people's decisions in a very particular way that makes it a form of group choice. Mm-hmm. We also know the ways it's distorted by money, by advertising. And so, it's hard to be too cynical, in a certain sense, about elections today globally. That said, the form is rarely looked at of elections as much as who gets to vote. I'm as interested also in how and why we do this weird thing of, say, in the US, we go to some public place to perform this weird act of going behind a curtain and pulling a lever with a menu of options. And sometimes we don't like any of them. In some cases, we don't even know who they are. Especially when you're voting for things like school board. A lot of people don't follow politics. They have no idea what they're voting for. Judges.
Unless you're in Iowa, because they do the caucus, so that's a little bit different,
right.
I guess. But
that is very different. Yes, that is. And now some places are experimenting with ranked choice voting. Some places are experimenting with online voting, which makes it more like going to Amazon. We are seeing some heterogeneity in voting patterns, and in different states in the U.S., different kinds of issues, from referendums to different kinds of officials, are on the ballot. Mm-hmm. In most nations, voting is much more nationalized. There's much less local variation. That's a very peculiar American form, that elections look different. Some states are winner takes all, some are not when it comes even to the Electoral College. There's an incredibly confusing array of laws out there. But the largest...
Trying to explain to my friends that live and are from other countries around the world how the United States does elections, I can see their eyes start to just cross out of like 10 minutes of explaining, well, okay, wait, what? What do you guys do? Like, it doesn't make it... It's so hard to explain.
The ballot design is different. The voting machines themselves are different. Some places list the party, some places don't list the party.
That's right.
Some are open. Some polls are open different hours than in other places. Mm-hmm. It's complete heterogeneity within a certain number of required norms, like mm-hmm. secrecy today. Mm-hmm. But that said, that's a very old thing in all democracies, going back to what were then called republics in the 18th century. There was much more emphasis on the sort of symbolic importance of the people having some say than on exactly how voting was going to work. And for the first 100 at least years of the practice of national elections to determine representatives, this is true in France too, there's incredible variety of approaches taken. Should we have secret ballots or not? Should the people decide collectively or singularly? None of this really becomes standard until really the turn of the 20th century into the 20th century. Today, it's considered a human rights violation if, again, individual choice is not recognized. And that follows the pattern for marriage, for education, for profession, for place to live. Our human rights are often framed as the right to choose X. And that means as an individual, not as a village or a family. That's a late development. And so there's some abstract way in which choice and democracy are related. But in practice, it turns out to mean a whole bunch of different things.
Yeah, the practice of it is interesting. And I think it is one of those things where people, they don't intend to have it that way, right? People don't intend to say, okay, well, we're gonna have it like this, or we're gonna do it this way. But in some ways, it sort of works its way out that way and kind of in the wash. And so it's very, very interesting. I had an episode on democracy, and it was by a historian, and she describes how democracy was really interesting. A lot of it was in secret here in the United States when it was designed, whereas it was very public in the French Revolution a couple years later. So it's just very interesting. She kind of gives like a kind of comparison between the two. Very, very fascinating. Well, I want to just end here with the epilogue. So there's one other chapter you sort of talk about some consumer research, and you kind of talk about multiple choice tests and how they were developed, which was very, for me, as the clinical psychologist, was very, very interesting to read that, right? Because we do so much assessment and different tests, and so that was very interesting for me. But you talk about the women's right to choose. So we kind of mentioned this earlier in the conversation about the abortion rights, and which you mentioned Roe v. Wade and things like that. And so it is kind of framed in this a woman's right to choose. How did we kind of just briefly continue to frame that specific issue in that way as a matter of choice? And I don't know, it feels like there's a sort of, despite all the different political things around it more recently and things like that, that people have a sort of, when they see, unfortunately, some of the negative practical things about it that can happen when you don't have that, it does seem that people's, maybe collectively, there's an evolution on this, right? That people can still be, quote unquote, pro-life, but they still recognize that people should have a right to decide what they want. Now, that's not everybody. Let me be clear. It's not everybody here in the States. And it actually is interesting in Europe, where they have these kind of 12-week kind of thresholds. Some have 18 weeks, but it's interesting how Western Europe does that as well in terms of the abortion issue. So yeah, what is this? We frame it or couch it in choice, and how do you see how that's evolved even to like kind of the modern period now?
Yeah, I end there because I think there's this fascinating moment in the 1970s, right after, as much as before, the decision in Roe v. Wade in the U.S. that legalizes abortion as a possibility, a legal possibility for women. It obviously doesn't ever encourage it as much as simply put it on the table as an option, in which the various sort of nascent women's groups, this is a really early moment still in feminism, but second wave feminism, start debating, how are we going to make a case here? How are we going to sell this to the public? And they get rid of some of the more controversial framings: population control, reproductive justice, healthcare. And they go with an idea that seems to work because it seems like something everybody by this point has agreed upon. Choice is a good thing. You don't have to like abortion. You don't have to have one yourself, but you're simply told people, as in many other domains, this is your personal choice. The same way you pick all kinds of other things, that, including whom to marry and whom to have sex with in the first place. Mm-hmm. And so it's picked, I think, at a kind of high point of the moment when choice itself has become a value. The value here is that women are being given the choice, whether they exercise it this way or not. Of course, it's quickly countered by an alternative position. Antagonists of abortion come up with the idea of a right to life and bring up a question which, of course, we've been debating ever since. Even if you're convinced that choice is valuable, aren't there some things that are more important than choice, or that trump choice in a certain way? Mm-hmm. Because, after all, there are things in our culture that we've kept outside the parameters of choice. And that debate is a very important one unto itself. Why, for instance, can I not choose to sell my baby? Why can I not choose to submit to working conditions that are totally abusive? Why can I not choose to buy certain kinds of stimulants and drugs? These are things where the harm to either self or other was understood to be important enough that choice isn't the highest value anymore. And abortion gets reframed. You know, we could talk about whether the various actors are acting in good faith or not by doing so, but if we just take literally the rhetoric that a woman's autonomy means the right to be able to make the decisions that are best for her life, which follows in a long liberal tradition, a counter tradition emerges that says, yes, but there are some areas in which we've decided that some things are beyond choice because of a harm that they entail. And in some ways, we're still fighting about that, because reproductive choice on the left is countered with things like school choice on the right. Mm-hmm. Choice is a value that tends to be held across the political spectrum. That's one reason I'm interested in it. It's not a partisan issue. It's not like one party is anti-making any decisions on your own. Right. But who gets to do the choosing and what they can choose can vary a lot. Very recently, in this past week, our current president has announced in some of his executive orders, and even in his inaugural speech, that he's going to restore choice in appliances, and choice in cars, and choice in light bulbs. And you think, what is this about? Well, he's evoking this very traditional American liberal rhetoric, but about something where, of course, there's going to be conflict, because one looks like, yeah, I should be able to choose whatever light bulb I want. Why not? It's my house. And the other side says, but your light bulb choices and other things are part of a collective need to lower our energy consumption, or to produce better, cleaner air. Same thing around public health questions when we saw the My Body, My Choice, which was a key 1970s invention made to support the idea of women's reproductive rights being harnessed to, I don't want to wear a mask, and I shouldn't have to get a vaccine to hold on my job. It's my body, my choice. And so then the debate is about the collective harm versus the individual freedom. And so that's where, kind of, in a sense, what we were fighting about in the 70s is still the framing of our arguments right now.
Yeah, it's a really nice way to say that, because it's always about choice. I would say the illusion of choice. I don't quite believe in free will, but yeah, I think we have this choice, this idea of choice, and with the outfits change, but at the core of it, we're still kind of talking about the same thing. So how do we choose this or that? As you gave plenty of examples, the COVID stuff. right, school choice, reproductive rights, all these in different sides pick what they want to do, or what they want to emphasize, I should say. And at the end of the day, they're not the same things, but it's the same underlying thing as this idea of choosing. I'll send my kids where I want them to go, or if I don't want them to go. And I think that is an interesting debate that we continue to have in different areas. So this is the kind of last thing I'll just kind of leave with is, when I was reading your book, I thought about choice, obviously, as you were describing it. And then I thought about this idea, as you talk about this kind of valuation that we place, or we make choice of value. And I kind of see things in terms of like kind of like a 3-layer kind of thing. So if you have morals kind of in the front, this is good, this is bad. I always think people don't always really care about morals. I mean, they say they will, but they'll say, I find when people say, is that a good thing to do, a bad thing, or is that a good decision or a bad decision or whatever? They're really asking what you value. That's what I see is behind morals, in my opinion, is what's your valuation? What are we valuing, right? The moral question is sort of irrelevant. I mean, it is important, but it's not as relevant. You're really asking, when I ask you, is that a good choice? I mean, what are you valuing, right? What is it that you value, right? And why, right? But even still further behind that, or kind of inward, is what people really want to know, which we never get because I don't think people themselves know it entirely, is what's your motivation? What's your intention behind your values, right? That's really nestled deep, I think, within the human experience. And trying to understand that. And so when I was reading the book, I thought, you could have all of this choice. Let's go all the way back to the beginning, right? You're in the grocery store, and you got the aisle, and you got 2,000 sticks of toothpaste, and you're just there, and you're like, I don't know what to do, right? I did see this. I was in my supermarket by my house, and I was getting yogurt, and I was like, it's literally, I mean, a whole entire wall of just different types of yogurt. It's so overwhelming.
Yeah.
And none of it's even like real, like, Turkish, Greek yogurt that was like, that's like the real stuff, right? Like, no, it's none of that. It's all this like, and I just, how do I make this decision? How do I make this choice? Now, I don't value yogurt that highly, right? And my intentions are pretty clear. I don't really care that much. But I make it when I'm overwhelmed, and I think a lot of people do this, even when you're not overwhelmed. We go by instinct. We go by intuition. I think people do that with religion all the time. They sometimes do it by, the arguments for and against, but they have this intuitive, instinctual thing, right, that pushes or pulls or drives. I think people do this with their political choices. I don't know why I like this guy. But you know what? He just feels right. He or she feels right. It just, they tell it like it is, or they're strong, or they're concerned, or they're compassionate. I just instinctually, I can't. And a lot of these things, people will have different intuitions about things that are motivated by obviously their familial makeup, their environment, but also where they're at that point in their life in terms of their identity. And I just find that behind choice is our known or unknown intuitions and instincts that are kind of the main engine that are driving it. That, in my view, if people took more time to really have some exploration and develop insight into some of those things, I think would kind of change how we do or don't make choices and impact the choices that we have in front of us. So I pitched that to you to just see kind of what you think about that. Or you could say I totally disagree, or whatever. But curious for your thoughts on this as it relates to the idea of choice.
I think it's a really interesting schema, actually. And I think that you're absolutely right that we bring values into our choices, even as we've moved away from a world in which the choice is generally presented at an earlier moment as do the right thing or do the wrong thing. Mm-hmm. Now there's this kind of pick that person on Tinder. I'm not telling you who that right person is. There's someone out there. It's your taste. It's
Right.
as long as you're both consenting, it's taste.
Right.
We have moved in some ways that direction, but yet again, people make their decisions based on a lot of other criteria. It's not we're not blank slates in any way, and we bring all kinds of things to our decisions. And again, this is not a screed against choice at all. But it is, I hope, a book about being self-conscious about why we make the choices we do, when we choose to choose and when we choose not to. And this could extend as far as public policy, but it might just extend into your own existence. Thinking about why am I putting so much value on that choice rather than another one? And back to the sort of personal psychology, even the question, what am I bringing to this choice? Is this just an instinctive thing, or am I operating out of some important to me criteria? And what I like as a historian, I'll just end with this, is that historians can show us that many of the things that seem absolutely natural into our world are themselves the product of previous people's decisions and shapings. And there's nothing really natural about the great value we place on choice. Sure, humans are wired to do a certain amount of decision making, and we could talk about free will and its parameters, but we've put a value on it that's entirely a kind of social construction. And why is this? I want to explore those reasons, but the reason I want to explore them is partly so that we are more self-conscious in our current life and in our future life about what we're doing when we either perpetuate those norms or break free of them.
Yeah, that's very well said, and I fully agree with you. And then this is sort of how I came up with. I was reading the book. It's very, very thought-provoking, and I kind of got to the end. I started with more thinking about, what is driving and pushing and pulling, us for choice. So it's really,
then
really,
you're
really,
the perfect reader. That's
right.
great.
Well, maybe, but yeah, that's where I kind of landed on it, which is a great place to land and a great place to end. Sophia, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. I greatly enjoyed your book. I greatly enjoyed our conversation. It was such a delight, such a treat, and big thanks. And you're welcome here anytime.
Thank you so much. It was really a pleasure talking with you.
Absolutely.